In part one of this presentation, we investigated the past and future roles of Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall. This was with a view to determining whether any connections could be made between those films and either Kubrick and/or The Shining. This in turn was in order to establish whether Kubrick had used this referential technique to weave into the very fabric of his film that faculty of shining which concerns seeing the past and the future. The conclusion was that there was indeed evidence, as demonstrated by subtle, easily overlooked references, both visual and within the dialogue. Part 2 of this presentation will extrapolate the same method used for Nicholson and Duvall and look at other members of the cast to see what their pasts and futures have to offer. Let's start with Mr. Ullman himself, Barry Nelson. Barry Nelson had a long career in film and television, during which time he actually became the first person to portray James Bond. But more cogently for our story, in 1973, he appeared in an episode of Ghost Story, also known as Circle of Fear. This was called Doorway of Death. Now it appears to be quite influential on The Shining. Let's have a look at it and see what you think. To give you a bit of background to this interesting episode, it concerns a widowed father called Jim, played by Barry Nelson, moving into a San Francisco apartment with his older daughter Peggy, portrayed by Susan Day, and his two much younger children, Robert and Jane. Exploring the block, the young son wanders into an unlocked upstairs apartment. Opening the door to a room, he encounters a parallel world. In this, he sees a snow-covered environment and a man chopping wood with an axe who he befriends. Robert returns from his adventure and tells both Jane and Peggy. The latter reacts rather sceptically to the tale, but acting as a surrogate mother gives some mature advice. She explains that as they're new to the area, the children will make friends when school starts. Now this is not unlike Wendy reassuring poor Danny, who had complained of having no one to play with. Peggy too emphasises that it's wonderful to have imagination, and even to invent playmates. It's a scenario Wendy, of course, is very well acquainted with. It transpires that the axeman's wife was dead, and it's a bloodstained bag that gives us a clue as to how it happened. Having learned that he'd bricked up her remains in a closet, Robert hazards a guess as to why. He concludes, he wanted to be with her forever and ever. Now interestingly, this is the second time in an actor's previous role that we've seen this famous phrase. Nonetheless, with their older sister's marital happiness in mind, the youngsters devise a plan for Peggy to become the axeman's new partner. And she does dream heavily of him, building a wall in a closet of the upstairs apartment, where a wall really does start to appear. She's then abducted by the axeman and imprisoned behind the wall. Fortunately, Jim returns from a weekend trip just in time to save Peggy from being entombed behind the brickwork. He smashes the wall down with an axe, just like Jack smashed the bedroom door down. And if that wasn't enough of a connection for you, he then makes an almost identical statement of incredulity about that incident as he did about the Grady murders as Ullman in The Shining. So hopefully you'll agree that this episode of Ghost Story appears to have been very instrumental in shaping The Shining. But the pilot episode of another series he starred in seems equally influential. It goes by the name of Mason. Like Danny Lloyd playing a boy called Danny, Mason Reese starred in the title role of Mason Bennett. He was older than Danny Lloyd, and his character was precociously mature, but there was one point of commonality. The hairstyle Lloyd was given does bear a marked resemblance to the one sported by Mason Reese. And then there's the subject matter. Remember that many commentators believe that Danny Torrance is supposed to have suffered sexual abuse at the hands of his father. The humorous opening of Mason depicts the father Howard, played by Barry Nelson, attempting a sexual advance towards his wife Peggy. However, he is shocked to find that she is already up and making breakfast and that Mason has slipped into their bed in her place. The cheekily witty Mason takes it all in his stride. He comments that what he likes about his dad is that they don't have the normal father-son relationship. Moreover, when his mother enters the room, he diffuses the situation saying, "That's okay, he only touched my tush and called me honey." In other words, there was no paternal sexual abuse. Now does that tell us something about The Shining? But as we leave the subject of Mason Reese, please forgive another little Masonic aside. And conspiracy theorists, don't get your hopes up. James Mason famously played Humbert Humbert in Kubrick's Lolita, uttering the line, "All the best people shave twice a day." Barry Nelson, as Ullman, of course utters the line about all the best people visiting the Overlook in The Shining. So is this the reason we see James Mason visiting the set of The Overlook in making The Shining? He was filming Murder by Decree at the time. Anyhow, James Mason aside, I hope that you've been able to see how Barry Nelson's role in Mason may have contributed to Kubrick's film. For a third example of Barry Nelson's work, we have to go back to the 1940s. And this example really does start to mess with time. It's a film called A Guy Named Joe. In Victor Fleming's A Guy Named Joe, Nelson played alongside Spencer Tracy, whose character was involved in an incident in a B-25 bomber during the war. On meeting Nelson's character, he makes a very loaded comment, as you can see in the picture to the left, and then reaches a very stark conclusion, as you can see in the picture below that. But for the moment, our real interest in this film lies not in its direct relevance to The Shining, but in the fact that this film also features as a future role for Barry Nelson. How? In 1983, Kubrick's friend Steven Spielberg produced Poltergeist, which was directed by Tobe Hooper. This makes a few references to The Shining. For example, the time the haunting in the film starts is shown on the television as 2:37, i.e. the same number as the haunted room in The Shining. It also shows Channel 3, and 3 is the number of the Torrance's apartment in The Overlook. Furthermore, the film ends by showing a room 217, a reference to the actual room number used in Stephen King's novel. Also very prominently featured on the television in Poltergeist was A Guy Named Joe. So, by virtue of this, A Guy Named Joe transcends time and becomes both a past and a future reference point for Barry Nelson. There are a couple of further points of interest. Also in the scene, there's even a Snoopy by the TV. Danny's bedroom had Snoopy stickers on the door. Secondly, Spielberg would remake this film in 1989, as always. I'll leave you to ponder on precisely why the subject of A Guy Named Joe is relevant, but hopefully you can see that Barry Nelson's career did provide strong connections to The Shining. Let's move on to Scatman Crothers now. Scatman Crothers was a friend of Jack Nicholson's, and as well as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was dealt with in the last presentation, Crothers had worked with Nicholson before on The Fortune, directed by Mike Nichols in 1975 and co-starring Warren Beatty, and The King of Marvin Gardens, directed by Bob Rafelson in 1972. In The King of Marvin Gardens, he plays a local hood called Lewis. At one point in the film, he says to someone, "I wonder why the hell you don't stay out of my kitchen." It's a phrase he uses twice to Danny as a warning about room 237 while in his kitchen in The Shining. So it may only have been 2 words, but they're 2 words that resonate very strongly with his role as Dick Halloran in The Shining. While filming of The Shining was taking place, Scatman Crothers also appeared in an episode of The Incredible Hulk called Our Favourite Magician. In this he plays a theatre manager, and in one scene he uses exactly the same manner to discuss previous acts as when itemising the contents of the C1 storeroom in The Shining. Now unfortunately, this doesn't come over too well in a still photograph, and anyway, you might consider it to be just his idiosyncratic style. But while he talks, workmen move furniture near a stepladder, just like in the closing day sequence. Now if those examples remain too tenuous for you, more tellingly, he then makes a joking reference to Napoleon, the subject of a film which Kubrick always wanted to make, and which therefore stands out to Kubrick fans. Kubrick had even wanted Nicholson, the Napoleonic soldier of the terror, to play the general in that film. Possibly reinforcing the connection between The Incredible Hulk and Scatman Crothers is the fact that Tony Burton, who played Durkin in The Shining, was in another episode of The Incredible Hulk called Like a Brother. In this, Dr. David Banner worked in a car wash, a fate which Jack Torrance was worried about. Of significance is the fact that the panelling of the car wash office appears to be a perfect match to Durkin's garage in The Shining. Now, set construction documents in the Kubrick archive indicate that in fact 2 garage sets were built. One was called Durkin's, the other was called Renner's. Now who knows what happened to that? Another arguable connection to The Shining stems from the fact that throughout this episode, a young boy is incongruously seen to be wearing a blue adult toweling robe. Albeit a lighter shade, it is very reminiscent of the ones which both Jack and Wendy are seen to wear in the film. Now looking at Scatman Crothers' future. In 1980 he appeared in Clint Eastwood's film Bronco Billy, in which he played Doc, the very name he used to call Danny in The Shining. There's an unusual scene in this film which depicts a horse on a railway track in a standoff as a train approaches. In some distant shots, the horse can be seen to be agitated and needing good rider control to keep it on the tracks. It no doubt understood that the train meant danger. It's a symbolic reminder of an Alex Colville painting called Horse and Train on the wall of the Boulder apartment. Past connections to The Shining for two actors can be immediately established by virtue of the fact that it was their third film with Kubrick. These are Joe Turkel and Philip Stone. Joe Turkel had previously appeared in The Killing and in Paths of Glory, and Philip Stone had previously appeared in A Clockwork Orange and Barry Lyndon. They both later went on to appear in cult movies. Joe Turkel went on to appear in Ridley Scott's 1982 dystopian masterpiece Blade Runner, set in November 2019. Its connection to The Shining is definite and incontestable. The original theatrical release actually used outtakes from The Shining's opening sequence to close the film. Very much a product of its era, Philip Stone played High Priest Zogi in Flash Gordon, directed by Mike Hodges in 1980. Brian Cook, the assistant director on The Shining, was also assistant director on this movie. The opening lines of the film make an enigmatic reference to the SK system. Now, there is of course no concrete proof that Stanley Kubrick was the intended reference point, but if not, the coincidences are really starting to mount up considerably. In a later video, I'll discuss a film which Anne Jackson appears in, as the subject matter would be more appropriate there. But as far as the other actors from The Shining are concerned, I won't go into them here, as many not only had small parts but were also relatively new to acting in movies. One interesting fact, though, was that four of them, Manning Redwood, David Baxt, Barry Dennen and Jana Sheldon, all went on to appear in the 1980 BBC production of Oppenheimer, a possibly appropriate subject when discussing the director of Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. So hopefully this has established the principle of how Kubrick was able to show glimpses of the past in The Shining by exploiting scenes and lines from his actors' previous roles. As concerns how he was able to know enough about their future roles to exploit that remains a mystery. Presumably as part of his homework when choosing actors, he was able to legitimately ask what future roles they were up for, or indeed already had. Presumably then, as a director of considerable influence, he could exploit his contacts in the industry and subtly manipulate these future films to accommodate his needs. So is it fair to say that he was manipulative in this way? Well, while it is of course conjecture, there is something in the film that might support the argument. One of the book spines visible on the lamp table in the Boulder apartment is Diane Cilento's The Manipulator. It concerns a group of film people at a festival in Acapulco. One of them is a highly manipulative film director called Nicholas Jebb, who was about to make a film at Elstree, where The Shining was filmed. Jebb felt it was impossible to manipulate an adversary without knowing him. By adversary, he meant everyone. It's a line which gels with a single-line description of Kubrick voiced by Jack Nicholson in Stanley Kubrick: A Life in Pictures. Here, he says that Kubrick felt that everybody was an opponent. In The Manipulator, we learned that there was only one person in the world who Nick Jebb did not think of as an adversary. That person was called Holden. It's a name which resonates with the subject of the next video. But at the beginning of part 1 of this presentation, I also offered to provide evidence of how Stephen Crane's short story The Blue Hotel supports my thesis. You'll hopefully remember that this was specifically cited by Kubrick in an interview with Michel Simon to illustrate how he had used psychological misdirection in The Shining. The story concerned a misguided premonition. Instead of happening imminently, it occurred in the near future, but in a different location. This misdirection, I believe, is analogous to references being found in future films of the actors who appeared in The Shining. Below is an extract from a film depicting the above-mentioned collection by Stephen Crane. As you can see, the book is open at the last pages, and in this particular edition, the last story is The Blue Hotel. Which film is it? Well, I'm going to leave you to find that out. It's not too tricky if you believe in my approach. If not, then good luck. So thank you for viewing this presentation. I hope the content was of interest, even if the production values left something to be desired. I'm afraid I'm not too gifted in that area. Also, please remember that this is just one small facet of the puzzle that is The Shining. To learn more, you'll need to follow the breadcrumbs, as it were, and view further presentations. So if you're interested in doing that, please remember to like, subscribe and share this one. Thank you.